Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking about crafting compelling stories, the key to successful software. As I was putting this talk together, I was trying to think, mainly when I was writing this line, the key to successful software, I was asking myself, how important actually are good stories? And I realized that most of the things that to be successful in delivering software, if you're not good at breaking down your work into small things you can deliver, you're not going to be able to deliver successfully. So this really is a key to everything that you could possibly want to, or anything that relates to success in delivering software. This underlies it, or at least if you're not good at creating stories well, breaking work down, you will be at a tremendous disadvantage and probably wreck the rest of your things, even if you're doing everything else right. So it's a very important piece. Talks coming up. So next month on the 24th, Nayan's going to be joining us to talk about embrace these three fearsome words, test in production. I worked with Nayan for a number of years. He's great. I'm really looking forward to this talk, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Also on the 26th of this month, Ryan Latta is going to be joining us. So you can see his name, there you go, to talk about limiting WIP. Whip into shape is the title he gave me. If you remember a year or so ago, Ryan did a talk about leading daily stand-ups and had some ideas. He said that as he was coming in as a Scrum Master, he'd come in, people would act like they were telling him what was going on. And he talked about some techniques to get the team working together, and the one that stuck out to my mind is like somebody would be talking to him, and so he'd just leave the room to help emphasize they need to talk to each other. Anyway, it was a hilarious talk to listen to, and I'm really looking forward to this one as well. 19th, we've got, so this isn't next week. Next week, we're talking Mastering Team Reflections, the Art of Reliable Retrospectives. So that's going to be exciting. These people are all sitting there retrospecting on something, I guess, or at least that's the closest picture I could find of stuff. And then next week, very excited about this, Jason Sweat's going to be joining us to talk about how to do test-driven development with the help of ChatGPT. Here a while back, I asked what people wanted to hear more about, and test-driven development was one of the big things people wanted to see. So last week, my son and I did a run-through, just kind of walking through test-driven development and pair programming. Jason's going to be talking to us about how he uses ChatGPT to help drive test-driven development. And he and I spoke a little bit about it, and he's got some really interesting takeaways in it. Kind of the way it's helping is different than maybe you might assume at first. So anyway, this could be an interesting talk. Okay, so for now, getting back onto our subject, what word best describes your role on the team? And I will put this in here. I'm going to put two links in here just because they're in my clipboard. It should be popping up in the next to the chat. If you don't see that for some reason, you can click on the link. Let me check here. Okay, so I think that's working. Oops. Okay, let me send the link here again. I've got two here just because so I don't have to type them in again. And I think if you do separate words, it will break them up, which is fine. You can use an underscore if you want to put it together. So as you're filling that out, I will just mention something that should keep it up for there as go. Just to remind you about youtube.com/AgileLNL. So this is where, like right now, this is being streamed to that location. You can go back. We've got different videos and stuff up there. I think we're at about 850 subscribers, or people who are subscribed to it. If you are so inclined, it's a big help to us if you go in and click on that. Okay, somebody said they're getting page not available. Did I misspell it? Watch me have misspelled my name somehow. Okay, it is working for me. The YouTube link isn't working? Oh. And yes, I misspelled it. There needs to be an L on the end of that. So, thank you for doing quality control there. You can search for it too, but here is the that should be the correct link. There we go. Okay, yes, thanks for putting that out there. Okay, so just if you are so inclined and can subscribe to that would be a huge help to me. Kind of lets me see what people are interested in on YouTube, and it also notifies you when new things do go up there. So back to our question, what word best describes your role on team? Looks like Scrum Master is a big one. Coach, product manager, facilitator, servant. I saw somebody type whipping boy. So the person that takes the blame, maybe. Um, Technical development architect. Poobah. Okay, well, that's a new one. I have not seen that one before. So lots of different things. We've got lots of different roles here that we're coming to. One thing that I think we ought to be thinking about, everybody may interact with the user story slightly different, but anyone that's involved in a team in delivering software is probably going to have some either interaction with user stories or some vested interest in them, one way or another. So let's talk about user stories. So user stories are how agile team, or let me say this again. User stories are how many agile teams have found as a good way to represent work and to keep themselves focused on what they're trying to deliver. So what best describes your feelings about user stories? So is it a silly way to say requirements, a very useful way to capture high-level details of real user needs, too little information to be useful, usually doesn't represent much of what the user really wants, love and adoration, or fear and loathing? How would you best describe your feelings? Adjustment here. Okay, so it looks like most of us are kind of in the camp of saying we are finding these useful, whether we may not completely love them. Should be beep is more like the okay. Usually doesn't represent much of what the user actually wants. And I see some comments saying that if it's done right, it's good. If not, it's horrible. I have run into a lot of people who are like, it's just a silly way to say requirements. And on one hand, there may be some truth in that. On the other hand, if that's what you're doing and it's just a silly way to say requirements, and you're doing requirements still as thick, huge, lots and lots of information, you may not be using stories in the way that in a very agile way. So we'll talk more about that as we go. Okay, so this is going to be up. I'll keep bringing this up as we go. If you think of any questions, feel free to submit them, and you can rank each other's questions, and we're going to try to leave some time at the end to go through this, or we can just chat if you don't feel like typing questions out. Either way's fine. Okay, so user stories start off as fiction, right? They don't describe the world. If they already describe the world, we wouldn't need a user story for it because that would already exist. So when I think of fiction, it's not like you don't want your stories to be war and peace, right? You want a small story that describes how the world is going to be different when you do the code, get the code in place to do that code or whatever it is that it's representing. And these need to be small. So if we think of terms of story, maybe we're thinking more of something like maybe a better way to think of it would be something along the lines of a comic book. Something that's fairly short. Or maybe even a comic book is too long and we need to think more of a comic strip, right? It's a small thing. We've got 3 panels here and it tells a story. There's an overall story arc that's still happening. It's not everything it's not the entire story, but it's enough of the story to move things along and has value in itself. If 3-panel cartoons didn't represent any value in making progress, you probably wouldn't read them. One of the best examples, I think, of being able to convey a complete story in very small amount is The Far Side. So we've got this guy over here, and when I was putting this together, it impressed me how much story goes into just this picture and 2 sentences. He says, well, let's see. So far, I've got rhythm, I've got music. Actually, who could ask for anything more? It's very, very concise. Now, a lot of things, like this guy is trapped on the island. You get the impression that there's a genie came out of a bottle. There's all this stuff going on, but it's a very, very small story. And this story doesn't even have any words to it, right? Or there's no dialogue happening. But it's a very vivid image of the future, or you can very much imagine what the future is going to look like here when he pops that balloon. So I think these are useful ways to think about small stories and thinking kind of comic strip. It's not an entire epic. It's a small thing that represents some fiction. So usually in our stories, we want to answer the questions who, what, and why. So oftentimes we use a template for that. Here's a common template. As a blank, I want to blank so I can blank. There's nothing special or magical about this template. Some teams have other templates they use and stuff. The big advantage of this is it kind of helps remove writer's block. Because if I'm thinking, okay, I need to say who this is for, what they're trying to do, and why they're trying to do it, I now can move forward, get something out really, really quickly. In addition to removing writer's block, it should help constrain what you're doing, right? If I have all my stories written like this, I've just got enough information to answer these questions. I'm not going to feel like I need to put a huge amount of information into it and turn it into a full requirements. Keep in mind, you're usually creating user stories at the point you need the user story. First thing you'll probably use a user story for is to prioritize it against other stories. If I write out a user story and it turns out it never is the next most important thing to work on, it might be good if I haven't spent hours and hours adding more and more details to it. So that's where, when I mentioned earlier that if we feel it's just a silly way to say requirements, it may be that we're trying to use user stories in the beginning to do more than we actually need. If this is prioritized, I probably want the really, really deep dive on the requirements, if you're using behavior-driven development, than the executable examples, to come a little bit closer to where I'm actually doing development, because otherwise it may be waste. I may do lots of stuff on this and then discover I don't need it for some reason. Client changes their mind, the competitive landscape changes, project gets canceled or whatever. There's all those things that can happen. An aspect of that, like when I mentioned a project getting canceled, imagine that you put, like, okay, so this will be an extreme, but imagine we've got this idea here of user stories that are really simple, concise, and gives us just enough information to prioritize. If we get ready to work on something, then we go and do a deep dive on all the requirements. Imagine you went the other extreme and you said, okay, we're going to get all the detailed requirements for hundreds of user stories all completely done before we're going to start on our development work. You could easily get into a point that you're still working on requirements, and the customer loses any faith that you're going to be able to deliver. So, and that type of thing actually happens, right? You've got put so much time into making sure you understand everything about the project that the customer is saying, you know what, we've been working for 6 months, a year, or whatever, and we're not seeing any software. We don't have faith that you'll be able to actually deliver this. We're going to go ahead and pull the plug on it. So that's where having small stories that you can prioritize against each other and start establishing trust with the customer of, hey, this amount of time, or this amount of money you paid us, we were able to deliver this. This amount of money, we were able to deliver this. So we want some of the details to actually happen just in time. So here's a user story, right? As a toddler, I want a Baby Shark button so I can play it on my own. So there's a simple story. We've got who, it's the toddler. We've got what they're wanting. In this case, it's very specific, almost a UI thing, Baby Shark button. So maybe we'd be better. Their intent is they want to play Baby Shark, but the reason they want this because they want to be able to get it on their own instead of having to wait for mommy and daddy to figure out what they're saying. So our user stories should answer the question: how will the world be better for the user? So here is a picture. It's more grainy than I realized, but this is actually my grandfather in Washington and the family cow and his niece, I think. And so the cow's here, and I don't know the name of the cow. My other grandfather, or my other great-grandfather on the other side of the family, whenever he'd buy a cow, he would name it after the wife of whoever sold him the cow. And that was a regular occurrence that he would do. And I'm not sure if that was a nice thing to do or not, but that's how the cows were named. Anyway, this grandfather, there he is. They had a family cow that they kept out in pasture behind their house. So here's a user story from the standpoint of the cow. As a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. Okay, so that's viewpoint. Here's a farmer. As a dairy farmer, I want cows milked on demand so I can maximize production. Now, I want you to see, and he's not a relative of mine. I want you to notice the smile on his face as he thinks about the future of cows being milked on demand so he can maximize his production. And I have not this gentleman, but I have a friend that is a dairy farmer, and he actually had this as a user story, and here was the implementation of that. He's got, I think, 2 or 3 of these machines. The cows just walk in, it figures out which cow it is, it figures out what nutrients it needs, it weighs it, logs all the information, it scans the udders with lasers to figure out exactly where they are, cleans them off, attaches it, milks the cow, and the cows love it because whenever they start getting uncomfortable, they walk in and this machine just milks them. He was asking me if I could hook up some stuff to, whenever the cow would come in, it would say the name of the cow. Does he want to maximize production or does he want to be more profitable? I'm assuming that maximizing production will make it more profitable if you maximize the amount of milk you're getting. And according to my friend, the more happy your cows are and the more comfortable they are, the more milk they produce, which is why he has a huge spinner brush that they can come up to and lean against and they'll spin just to scratch their back because he wants happy cows. Stories that support our principles foster good development. But the opposite of this is also true, that bad stories will hinder our development process. So back to the idea of this being fiction. It's fiction, but it's written from the user's point of view. We want to think about how would the user express this. And progress is going to represent that the user can do something that makes them happy, right? They're able to do something that they couldn't do before. I got a question, how to write a story that describes the requirement of the API. We talk more about that at the end. If you are actually producing an API and your end users are using an API, then maybe that makes perfect sense. And you need to think about how the user is going to experience it. In a lot of places, though, you're not creating a API. You are creating a product that happens to have an API, and that that describes your architecture. It doesn't describe the way people are going to interact with your software. So what I encourage teams to do is try to think of, is there any way we can have a user story that's driving all the way through the software from the standpoint of how the user is going to use it, instead of having the architecture drive how you're building it. Not that you won't build an API, but building in increments and units of work that actually, let's see, I'm gonna have to dig into that a little bit more. But the big thing we want to do, though, is think in terms of who's the user, who's the person that's going to use this application, and how do I deliver something in a unit that they can actually consume. Not necessarily the way I'm going to think about breaking it up as a developer, but a way that they can actually use it. Something that lets them do something that they weren't able to do before. And if I'm just delivering something, like let's say I've implemented a database, right? That's great. They may very well need a database, but that may not be something they can experience. If they can't experience it, I want to try to find some way that I can get a user story that will drive the creation of the database, but it's something that I can say, I'm done with this because the user can do something that they couldn't do before and they're a happy cow, well, or happy user, whatever it is they happen to be doing. Don't call your users cows. That's probably not a good thing to do. So that was progress. Progress is user can do something new that makes them happy. Waste is going to be stories that don't have any return on investment for the user. And it's really easy to fall into this trap because there's lots of things that we start saying, well, this will have the return on investment for the user in the future. And that's true, but that's not, and it may be true, may not be true either. But if we start thinking in terms of how do I build something that the user can't use now, I'm likely to go a long ways down the path without getting feedback from the user. And many times that will, if I guess correctly, maybe it's great. If I guess incorrectly or something changes, the cost of that may be way worse. The cost of that often is so great to offset any benefit of trying to plan things out ahead of time. In other words, if I'm thinking in terms of I want to deliver this to the user in the way the user thinks about it, I may have to do something and then rewrite it in the next story a little bit and then rewrite it in the next story a little bit. And that sounds like, oh, that's waste because we had to change some lines of code that we wrote. In theory, it is. In actual practice, it very rarely turns out. In actual practice, there are so many other things that can change in software projects that getting something that the user can actually experience gives you feedback that is so much more valuable than any waste of, hey, I wrote this, got feedback from the user. So stories with no return on investment for the user are things you want to stay away from because that leads you to creating lots of waste, even though it's a little bit unintuitive. It's kind of almost the backwards of how you might think about it. Checking the comments here. Cool. Okay, so here's a story. Now, I am a big fan of CI/CD pipelines and automated deployment and building things automatically and stuff, right? Those are very, very important, very, very vital to an agile team's ability to deliver. But if you have a story that looks like this, as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. Okay, well, let's just imagine that. So imagine that story. How does that story make you feel? On a scale here, I'm going to check the comments right here while you guys fill that out. So Will, I like your comment, right? If you start having all the architectural details in the story itself, you end up driving your software from the standpoint of the architecture. And driving it from the standpoint of the architecture puts you in a position where you start building things that are really hard to get feedback from the user. And if you don't have the feedback from the user, it's very easy to spend a whole lot of time building something only to find out it's not what they actually need. It could be exactly what they said they wanted, but it may not be what they actually need because they don't get it in front of them. And the place you really find out what a user needs is when you give them something and let them try to use it. Okay, so we've got some people think this story is great. A lot of people are like, yeah, it's okay. Some people are thinking it's sad. I would be more in the sad camp, and the reason is because if we have a story like, we have a story like this doesn't actually produce any return on investment from the user. We may very well want to do this, but imagine I sit down and so if I'm going to have a story like this is likely to be my very first story, right? And is it bad to build a pipeline? Well, no, it's not bad to build a pipeline. Now, if you are actually providing CI/CD services, like you're building a CI/CD product, you'd still need a story that's built more around what maybe your users actually are developers or something like that. But in the case I'm talking about, you're trying to build something, and one of the things you need is having a pipeline. So if I do this, if I have a story like this, I am very likely to, as a development team, we are very likely to build a bunch of pipeline work ahead of time, right? Before we actually have something to deploy on it. And this may even take a few weeks or a few months, or in some places, I've seen people spend 6 months or a year trying to do things like this. And the idea is, then when we get to this point, we will be able to start deploying stuff. What happens a lot of times if you try to do this is once you start trying to build the software, you discover all the things that you needed to know when you were building the pipeline that you didn't know because you tried to do it ahead of time. And a couple things can happen. One is you can then try to shoehorn your development into this pipeline you created. I've seen that happen before. You can also end up having to rewrite most of the pipeline. And you can also end up with a situation where you run this direction and then it gets canceled because you can't actually deliver the software fast enough. On the other hand, if we think more in terms of how we're going to deliver, so what might happen if we treat the pipeline as progress, we'll go a very long ways before we actually try to use it for something. If on the other hand, it's like, well, what's the first thing we need to do? We've got this application. We want to deliver the application. First user story, maybe as a user, when I go to the page, I see the name of the application in the title. That's dead simple. But to actually set it up, and if your definition of done includes having it deploy automatically, you're going to have to build out some of the pipeline to do this. But you've got a test. You've got something that you're using to prove it against that the pipeline does what you want. That will give you, and that user story of just getting that page up that's got the title there can drive just the thin piece of this that you need. So you don't necessarily need a story for this. You need a story for what you're trying to deliver to the customer. And this is just part of the implementation details or your definition of done. If you've got an environment where deploy it has to go through CI/CD, which isn't a bad place to be. This just becomes part of delivering it. And then your pipeline evolves in response to what the user's asking. So why do software projects fail? Well, it's because they don't deliver working software, and working software being things that the user can actually see. We want to build from the user's perspective. And so we want to think about how does the user think about the software. So let's look at some examples here. So let's say, I live down in Fort Scott, Kansas, which is about 90 miles south of Kansas City. And imagine that there were no roads between this town and Fort Scott. I mean, there's other towns between here. So I'm going to say, as a driver of a car, I want a path leveled from Fort Scott to Kansas City so we can put down a granular subbase. Okay, this is not a story that provides the user of a driver of a car with any value, right? We've bulldozed a bunch of stuff out. We're going to put a granular subbase right now, but it's just a muddy mess all the way to Kansas City. Maybe we can, but the driver of the car can't actually use this. So what if we were to take this and try to say, this is what we want, right? Eventually, we think this will be a step, but this isn't something that in and of itself provides an incremental step of value. So what if we had something like this? As a driver of a car, I want a highway from Fort Scott to Pleasanton. So here's Fort Scott where I am down here, and Pleasanton's right about here. Okay, so maybe I take an incremental step. Let's get that working and see if, make sure we're capable of creating a highway. So that might be an incremental step. But maybe that's pretty big as well. Right? Do I even want to go to Pleasanton? I don't know. Once I get there, I may decide I don't want it to be there anymore. What if we tried something like this? As a driver of a 4x4, I want a trail from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can travel in good weather. So think something like this, right? I'm not even going to worry about it if it's raining or in the winter. I just want to say, can I get some path between Fort Scott and Pleasanton so I can start getting there? It may not be easy, but I can actually start using this thing in the very smallest way possible. Next story might be something like this. As a driver of a car, I want a gravel road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. And somebody mentioned this earlier, so this very much has implementation details in it, right? We could change this to something else. But what I'm wanting to really illustrate, though, is we're taking incremental steps, not in, the analogy does break down, right? We're working with gravel and stuff here. But we're taking incremental steps to give some value of being able to get from one place to the other instead of focusing on how we're going to do the first step in creating an entire highway. So then maybe I've got this, right? I've got a gravel road. I can now possibly, even if the weather's bad, I can get back and forth. Before I couldn't. If the weather was bad, there was no way I could get through. But now I can get back and forth even if it's raining. And maybe sometimes in the winter if there's not too much snow. Then maybe I've got another one is as a driver of a car. I want a paved road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth regardless of the weather. So these are all different incremental steps toward, the end goal. Maybe I want to go to Kansas City. So I've got, now I've got a paved road that goes all the way back and forth there. So after that, then maybe my next step would be as a driver of a 4x4, I want a trail that goes from Fort Scott to Kansas City. We're going to go the rest of the way so I can drive back and forth in good weather. Maybe that's the next step. So now I've got, another trail looks something like this that gets me all the way to Kansas City. But with this story, what if we want a highway, don't we? Right? That's the goal. But what if we change our mind once we get there, right? If I put a highway all the way to Kansas City, and then once I get there, I decide that's not a place I want to go, I can't just take it back. I've done all this effort already. So think of something like this, right? On second thought, let's not build a highway to Kansas City. 'Tis a silly place, right? We changed our mind. We didn't want to go there. No offense to anyone in Kansas City. I love Kansas City. But my point is, by taking incremental steps, we can get feedback on whether we actually want to continue the rest of the way, and it can guide and direct us. So here's a cake. We often think of applications, we often think of the being architects something like a cake. So like at the top, you got your candles, and maybe that's your UI. And then you've got what the UI talks to is the top level, maybe. Then you've got some business logic, and then you've got your database and stuff down at the bottom, something like that. So you don't usually have a user come and say something like this, right? You don't have a user come in and say, I want this slice, said no one ever, right? Your users aren't coming to you and saying, I want this slice right here, bottom, give me a database. The user's saying, I want a database to, you got an accounting system and they just want the database. That's not how the user thinks about it. Now, if you're a kid that only eats frosting, right, I want this slice. I want just the edges all around. I'm just going to lick the frosting off, maybe. But that's, probably not completely applicable to software development. But what somebody that's going to actually use the software needs a slice that goes all the way through, right? It needs to have a UI on it so they can actually interact with it. It needs to have the business logic. It needs to have the database all the way through. And it's so easy for us to try to write stories that are more like this, like, oh, well, this is what the customer really wants, right? Is this entire database designed? Instead of thinking more in terms of our product team would tell us, yes. Well, they do want a piece of the bottom slice, but what you want to do is give them part of that, just enough for them to give you feedback on whether what you're delivering is what they want or not. If we build out the entire database and then start working with them, you build out the entire database and then you build a bunch of stuff on top of it, and then they use it like, hey, yeah, this doesn't work. We need to change all this. We need to change it. Well, they wouldn't even ask probably in terms of the database, but they ask for it to be changed. And you find out that everything you did down here doesn't work anymore, has to be reworked. You're going to be making a lot more changes than if you go all the way through, get it working, get feedback from them, and then discover like, hey, this doesn't quite work, or we did something temporary and now we need to change it. What team I worked with that was really embracing this, they had something, and the user was asked, I can't remember what the first thing was. It was one of the very early stories. We had already done a story which is like the user can go to the page and see the logo. So that was done. It was the first of a multi-stage thing where the user would enter in information and it would walk you through stuff. So it needed to store it somewhere. So what this team did is they used the most dead simple database they could on Amazon, using it as a service, just came up and were able to deliver it to the user, let them try it. The user said, yes, we can experience this now. This is what we want. Now, the database they were using and the backend they were using for it was not what they wanted to use in production at all. They were just doing the simplest thing they possibly could to take a step forward and get feedback from the user. The next story they asked for, they were getting ready to build some more, and they're like, okay, now let's replace the backend with this thing that we really do want. So it was originally done with Node, and then they replaced it with Java. And that took an incremental step and let them move forward. And it kept evolving as they went. But the ability to get that feedback early on in the places when the user had a different opinion or there was some miscommunication was well worth any, hey, we had to write 10 minutes of code and then later we replaced it with something else. The clarity of building the right thing based on the feedback from the user was worth way more than the cost of doing something really simple and then getting feedback on it. We often think about building software like building a house. Like you can't build the top of the house until you've built the foundation. That's probably not a good way. Thinking of a house the way that you build software probably will mislead us with our analogies a lot of time, because we think of having to pour the entire thing. Now, it probably is a little bit more similar to trying to remodel a house that you're living in at the time, where it's like, okay, we need a working bathroom. We're going to get this bathroom working, even if we're going to change out the sinks and faucets later on, but we'll get that working, start getting being able to use it, and then we'll work on this part over here. The house we're in right now, we've done quite a bit of remodeling work too, and there were things, sometimes we built something and then stepped back from it and had to take parts out to build something else. It wasn't inefficient to do that because it let us live in it at the time. We were able to start using it, and some of the things we initially thought were going to be valuable to us weren't once we actually started living in the house and discovering what was important to us and what wasn't. So here's these pictures again, just kind of visualize, starting out with that's just a trail, maybe a bulldozer went through, and we're able to start getting back and forth between two points. We can then find out, do we even want to go to that? Maybe we thought we would go to Pleasanton, but it turns out there's another place that really has what we're needing for delivering goods or whatever. Then we move to this right here, where we're now going back and forth on gravel. We can go faster. We can go at more times of the year. It's still not a super expensive road that we put in. It's not ideal. You can't go as fast. There's rocks flying up. You have to replace your windshield every once in a while. But then once like, okay, that's working well, then you can come back through and pave it. And these are all steps toward like the goal of having a highway, but they're incremental. And yes, there may be some waste, but the amount you learn in the process, like if you did the trail through and you discover, hey, there's a river here that we had to go around, so you wasted by having to go around the river, and later when you come through, you actually put a bridge across it. That's not a bad thing, right? You've learned stuff as you go. So there's the power and the danger of metaphors, and the way we think about stuff, the metaphors we use to describe things has a very big impact on how we think about solutions. So we have physical experiences and abstract ideas. And if we're thinking of software in terms of carving it in stone, we will probably do things that make perfect sense for working with granite, but not a lot of sense when we're working with software. Software is much more like sketching. You draw the horse, you draw the circles and different things, and you sketch it in, and you erase some and add stuff. That describes the process of creating software much more than trying to, carve the Sphinx or something like that. A better example, I think, than building a house would be the way that we build a city. A city is something that responds to change. There are subway lines in New York City right now that aren't used because they used to be valuable in taking people between these 2 points. Now traffic patterns have changed and there's other ways of getting there, and so those aren't used anymore. That's not a bad thing. That's just a process of the city growing to handle what its needs are, and those needs do change. Cities respond to change, and we probably should think more of our software as growing it versus building our software. Because building gets us thinking in terms of, I'm going to put this in and it's always going to be there. Growing it has the idea that it's going to adapt and change over time, and we're going to try to get. You don't start with a full stock of corn, right? It grows over time, but you get it alive, and then the work becomes easy. So a question for you, kind of along these lines, is if a ship replaces one board every year for 800 years, so eventually every part of the ship has been replaced, is it still the same ship? So if you've taken a psychology class, you may recognize this as the ship of Thesis, or Theseus. And there's not a right or wrong answer here, right? Yes, Theseus' ship. So the story of, so Theseus was the one that went and killed the Minotaur, so kind of in the labyrinth, kind of a similar, he ripped the plot off of the Hunger Games, I think. Well, 800 years later, Socrates had been sentenced to death, but he couldn't, they weren't allowed to execute anyone while this ship was making this sacred voyage back and forth. This was 800 years later, and it was the ship of Theseus that had to go out and come back. Well, those 800 years, ship made out of wood isn't going to last 800 years. They replaced parts over and over again until the ship was probably made up of material that was not made up of originally. So we're saying, yes, it's the same ship. Some of us think, no, it depends on if you're selling it or not. So that's a good point. The thing I want us to think about, though, is this ship still is functioning. They kept the ship running, right? They were able to use it during this time as they replaced different parts on it, maybe improve them. Maybe they had higher quality wood or something. But the point was they were able to replace these things over time. And that's really how we ought to be thinking of software in terms of where the ship would get them between places. That's what was valuable about it. And they were very willing to replace parts as they needed to over that time period. That's probably how we ought to be thinking about software as well, is yes, we have this lines of code. We're going to write this line of code and use it and get value out of it, but then we are going to be very happy to rewrite that line of code later when there's something else we need to do with it. But if you waited forever before the ship is actually able to sail, the project to build the ship might get canceled before you actually get it out of the water. Anyway, so just something to think about. So here's a chart that I like. If we think of, so we got all these rectangles represent stories, okay? And we've got one option up here and another option down here. So think in terms that this applies in other areas, but think in terms of a system that we are trying to, we're going to try to replace an existing system, right? We're going to rewrite a system and then cut over to it. So if we're doing that, maybe we will have something where we've got some stories that are just capable of demonstration, kind of like my thing, a rough means of producing the desired result, just to show we're headed in the right direction. We've got other stories that are deployable to production, right? So capable of demonstration, maybe we can show that the logo shows up on the top of the page, or the title shows up on the top of the page, just to show we can get something out that people can get to it. Deployable to production means that you got something like this is code that we're going to be happy running with production. Viable as the system of record means the bare minimum of a feature, it'll include the first three, but the bare minimum of features to be able to run in place of the current system. So it doesn't even mean it does everything the current system does. It's just from a business standpoint, you could get by and your business could still function in some manner by having those things. And then the blue would be include all the other existing features that the current system does. And then the purple is the new features, enhancements that the current state doesn't have today. Oftentimes it's the purple features that are driving the reason we're rewriting it. Oftentimes what happens is we end up starting with something like this and we start saying, okay, we're going to build these purple features first because we want to show people these new features because that's how we're justifying rewriting it. So we start with the new features to prove that we can do them and let everybody see how great they are. Then maybe we get, the third one there is an orange one, something that would be deployable to production. And we go all the way through, but the point is we get over here and we only get to the point where we can replace the existing system at the very end here, right? So that's the only place that you can go live and start getting real life feedback from it being used. The other approach is to say, okay, can we order our work in a way that we can use it sooner? Can we make our user stories in a way that gives us the idea of, okay, we're going to get the capable of demonstration. We're able to use this as a skateboard to get from point A to point B. It's not the end state we want to be in, but we can start getting that feedback sooner on. And if we're able to sequence our stuff like that, we get to here and to the bicycle stage, and maybe we're now able to go live as a viable system of record. It's not that we want to ride on a bicycle forever, but we actually have that option where we didn't really have that option in the first case until we went over here. Now, there may be some reasons, like the new features, if having a new feature would mean, if there's a feature that's being used to say, this is why we're rewriting the system, and there's significant risk associated with it, enough risk that if you weren't able to do it, and you're not confident you can do it, they would cancel the project, that would make perfect sense to do that sooner, right? So you can fail fast. But oftentimes, we just have these cool things people want, and those get pushed in front of the things that we absolutely have to have in place to go live. Okay, so similar thing right here. What I wanted to point out, though, is if we're aiming toward having really, really small stories, we may find that some of these features can be split, and there's a piece of it that's minimally viable and another piece that is a new feature, or a piece of it that's minimally viable and a piece of it that's existing functionality. If we're able to split those things, we can then reorder them and actually go live sooner. If you noticed here, see where the yellow was on this bottom part? It was quite a while before we had the minimally viable that we could go soon live with. Here, we've moved that over because we were able to split features into parts that were minimally viable and parts that were existing functionality. We may also find that there's parts of these, if we start splitting these up, that there's things we could actually leave out. Things that we could say, okay, it turns out we're not going to need to do that. We're going to either defer it or never do it. Or maybe we don't know, but we could go live without it. We take all those things and put them at the end. Now we've got the ability to go to be done with what we were planning on doing even sooner. And then maybe you can come back and do these things there. Okay, let's see, what time is it? Okay, so I'll go through this. Right, you may have seen this before, but we'll talk about Sam's shoes. So this is an example, so not necessarily a case study, but just kind of an example of Sam's Shoes is a very prestigious seller of shoes. They are not online, but they're realizing they need to start selling stuff on the internet in order to stay competitive. So Sam has a story like this. As Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. If we think in terms of working software being the primary measure of progress, this isn't as bad as some stories being, but it's probably something we need to find a way to do a piece of it instead of this. I mean, this is everything, right? It's still better than some stories like this where you have, as a user, I want the system to work so I will be happy. Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. This implies all kinds of things, right? This implies that we've got shopping cart, credit card processing, loyalty program, customer login, saved addresses, inventory, recommendation engine, and we could probably come up with a bunch of other things that we would feel fall under that category. So if we start with something even simpler, is as a customer, I want to see inventory so I can call in to order. Well, we've now taken the e-commerce part completely out of this. So maybe we build a page that looks something like this. We've got Sam's Shoes, call to order, and there's a list of our shoes and the prices. Now, this sounds very, very simple, but there's quite a bit of work that would need to go into doing this, right? We'd have to set up our pipeline to deploy the code. We'd have to figure out how we were going to get through the firewall to get to the inventory control system. We'd need to work out all these things. We'd have to, well, at this stage, maybe we wouldn't even need SSL certificates. There's other things, but we'd have to make sure that our system was secure. So what's the return on investment of this? Well, we now can hopefully start getting some orders from people that wouldn't have known about our product either. We can start showing up in Google for results. We can get metrics. We improve out our assumptions. And we may find that the people who buy shoes from Sam's shoe store are not interested in doing anything online. So maybe we're now looking at a different segment of customers, which might influence how we build our site. Or we may find that we need to build our site very differently because of the particular type of customers we have. So there's lots of return on investment from just that simple thing. Okay, so next story. So what's the next simplest story? It might be I skipped a slide here. Okay, so Zappos did something kind of like this when they first started. You'd think that to sell shoes, you need to own shoes, but not Zappos. What they did is they went and took a bunch of pictures of shoes from Foot Locker and places like that, and then returned the shoes. And then when someone would order them, they'd go back to Foot Locker, buy the shoes, and then ship it out to them. And they were trying to prove out that their system worked before they made the big investment in all their inventory control and then those types of things. Okay, so simplest next story. Let's say as a customer, I want to order online so I don't have to call. Well, maybe we do something really simple like this, right? We've just added an order button. We don't even have shopping cart. We just have you click on the order button and it takes you to a page and you type in your size, your name, your address, and your credit card number. So this is very, very simple. It very much is not the end desired state, but it's an incremental step toward that. Now we're assuming you can't just drop it in an e-commerce system here and get it all to work. But in this is a step. The users and the customers can now do something that they couldn't do before. Then we might have another story. As a customer, I want to add items to a cart so I can order multiple items. Okay, so now we're going to add them to a cart. This should make it very evident why I'm not usually putting graphic design for e-commerce stores. And then we've got a way to take them out of the cart, right? When we don't want them. Then we have another user story. As a customer, I want to save my address so I don't have to re-enter it. Or I want to save my credit card so I don't have to re-enter it. There's all these different pieces here. I'm going to skip over that one. Okay. So that's what I was hoping to get to there. So back to this then. The big point is, though, these are all very small stories. They're very much written from the standpoint of how the user is going to experience your application. And it isn't always easy to do this, but you will get far greater value from building it from the standpoint of the user like this than you will trying to build it from the standpoint of just layers for the developer. So let's jump over here and see. I see there's lots of stuff in the chat. Let's see. What's the best way to make user stories useful to engineers? So when I said you don't want it to be full-blown requirements, that doesn't mean you can't put more useful information in it. But usually if the user stories aren't useful to the engineer, there's a couple reasons that could be the case. One could be that it doesn't mean anything to the engineers because the engineers aren't working close enough with the users. The user stories I've seen most engineers get the most value out of if they're actually talking to the customer and they see the user story and say, hey, you're asking for this. Here's why you say you're wanting to do this. Here's another way we could do it that we think would be simpler, but we think it does what you want. And the customer being able to say, oh no, we really need to do it this way and here's why. And then the engineers having a better understanding of what they're doing. Or the customers say, oh yeah, that's just how I said it. What you described sounds even better. Let's do that instead. Or what you described, if it's faster, let's do it that way because I don't really care between these two options. So having the user stories enable those conversations is probably one of the ways to make them useful to engineers. And a great way to do that is behavior-driven development, because if the engineers and the customer or whoever's paying for the software, the user, customer, business owners, and testers are all getting together and talking through creating examples before they start on the software, then the user stories become very, very useful because that's the starting place for those conversations. I have a team who were told that a story needs to be completed in 2-week sprint. This means they're slicing them all wrong. Analysis story, dev story, testing story. So the issue there sounds like what's happening is they're being told it needs to complete in a sprint. And instead of saying, okay, how can we get a thinner slice all the way through the cake? They're breaking the work down into the steps they want to take for it. That's where the team needs to make a shift. And this is hard to do. I'm not trying to say it's easy, but the team needs to make a shift to saying, what's the smallest thing we can deliver? And actually working with the customer and saying, okay, how can we show you that we're making progress forward in a way that you could actually demonstrate to someone? So, like I said, the thing of just showing the logo and the header, showing a logo and a header on the page is not a huge thing, but it is something that the customer can then show and say, hey, look, I can see this now. It's been deployed where I can see it. I could not see it before. We're done with that. So looking for those slices that go all the way through are really what you want to strive for. The problem with breaking stuff up like this is it will end up taking a lot longer to deliver anything because you've got all these start and stop points that aren't built around the way that the customer actually delivers the software. And I'm not trying to say it's trivial to do, but you can get teams to that if you just keep asking, okay, how would the customer demonstrate this to someone? And if there's not an answer of how the customer would demonstrate it to someone, keep on going back and slicing things down until you have some way that the customer could demonstrate it to someone. Okay, somebody's saying a design engineer. So I think you're talking about where the design is not being done as part of the story or mechanical. Will, if you're still around the end, I want to hear more about this because I think you may be talking about stuff in hardware, which is interesting. I want to hear a little bit more about that. Okay, let me get through the rest of these, then I'll stick around if anyone wants to chat. If your user story contains all the software layers, how can it fit in one sprint? So if we're talking about a sprint being 2 weeks or something like that, if you're focused on it, it very much can be done. If it can't be done, your software is going to take forever to deliver anyway, and you probably need to rethink it. But if you've got a team of, let's just assume your mob program, you got five developers, and they're working on delivering a story that does the simplest thing that you could demonstrate to the user. If you can't build something that has, a form, a button, and then it shows up on another page, that just that thin slice, if you can't deliver that in 2 weeks, then there's probably something you probably need to rethink things. Now, that doesn't mean that you have a form and a button and it goes through this back end and does this and does all these things. You may have to kind of build out, if you've got a complex architecture, well, one, if you can simplify it, that's even better. But you may have to build this piece right here to demonstrate this part, and then a little bit further for the next thing. Like, for example, a very common pattern is I come into this page and I fill out all 100 form, this form takes me this page, fill out more information. It gives me a summary at the end, and then it eventually will stick it in the database and run checks on it. And that could be hundreds of fields that you're filling out with different options and different paths through them. So you could potentially say, okay, let me try just one field, like let's say mortgage application or something like that. I'm going to fill out my name and a mortgage number, and then get that to the database and have it on a confirmation screen. And that could be a lot of work because you got to build the database and everything for it. But it's just really, really simple in the part the user experiences, but it's still something that means something to the user. If you take it through like that, the next one should be a lot easier because, at least as far as setting up the database, so maybe you can grab 3 or 4 more form fields on the next thing. So looking for ways to actually slice that stuff up to where it's still something the user can experience, but you're just getting little pieces of the things that are harder, which could be, doing 1,000 fields on the page is probably going to be, or on the workflow is going to take you a lot longer than just doing one. Hopefully that helps with that. But there is a skill to it, and it takes a while to get used to doing that. Let me see if I can, okay. Is it pertinent to have a user story to describe non-functional work? For example, as a developer, I want to deploy my services on Azure securely so I can deliver value to the customer. I would suggest not doing that because it's not being driven by the thing that provides value to the user. So I would encourage people to stay away from stories like that. If you need to deliver it on Azure, have that as part of your definition of done, where stories aren't done until they're actually deployed all the way through. Now, that means the first story you deploy all the way through might take a while, so make it as small as possible. If you're just deploying a logo all the way through to where you can see it, then you get the web hosting part set up. The next story, if it touches the back end, might get the application layer set up. So you can break it down to where you're still delivering stuff all the way through without having stories that are just describing how the setup work you're doing to help support the stories. Is Gherkin the most powerful way to write acceptance criteria? I like Gherkin. I think what's powerful is having writing examples that you can make executable. Gherkin is one way to do it. Cucumber is the way to do it. There are other ways to do it, but having an example and actually talking through, let's give a concrete example of this and make it executable so we can run it against the system. I think that's the thing that's powerful more so than what language you happen to be using. Are you using personas to write user stories? In this case, I had who the user was. Some teams love using personas for things. I've seen some really cool ones. Some teams had their cat as one persona. That was the admin user, and some of that stuff was great. You can get a long ways. I think the big thing is make sure you know who people, who's the person that's going to be using this. Particularly with really complex systems, I think personas can be helpful. It can also be very helpful if you're needing to include in your thoughts more marketing and design experience attributes of things. Instead of stories, what could be used to represent PBIs? What's a PBI stand for? I'm not clear on that. Instead of stories, what could be? So you can use other things. The nice thing about user stories is they kind of force you to having really, really small units. And the force from doing it from the user perspective is the thing that can be really valuable. Who oversees user story writing? Usually it's done with I mean, it depends on your structure. It often will need input from the developers, but they don't have to be the first person to do it. Keep in mind, if at the very beginning you're just getting just enough information to be able to prioritize it, it's probably going to be something very closely related to the customer and whoever works with the customer. User component teams. If you've got component teams, if we're talking about people that are building things that don't actually deliver value to whoever your customer is, that one's going to be a little bit tricky depending on who the customer are. Chat diversity. Okay. Well, here, let me take a look. I'm going to skip on the rest of these and take a look at the chat, see what's happening, because it sounds like you guys are doing interesting things there. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, does anyone have any, okay, somebody's saying they thought that the getting something out of users to interact with to get feedback for learning. Okay, so Bradley, I think you've got a good question there. If you aren't used to, and I think that's what you're asking, if you aren't in a situation where people are used to actually delivering stuff and letting the users do it, a couple ideas. One is start rethinking how you do your demos. If you can have a real customer drive in the demo, or whoever is paying for the software or something like that, that is very, very valuable for a couple reasons. One, it shows that it's not a it's not a fake demo, but it also puts you in a position where they're actually needing to be more involved and understand it enough to be able to demonstrate it. So that's one thing that can be helpful to it. Okay, so I see. Okay, see, I see a thing here. I think this may be a quote from somebody early. Is that you've got a technical team that's trying to put all the details of all the steps they need to do into the. They want to represent all the individual pieces of what they're doing. Am I saying that right? Is that what people are talking about? Okay, so it's very easy to assume you want to shift your developers from the idea of doing a series of tasks to the idea of they're delivering something for the user. And oftentimes, if they're trying to create stories for individual things, their idea of what they get credit for is for closing tickets more so than delivering something to the user. So when I see and it's not, if I see a team that's coming in and they're trying to create a bunch of little tiny tasks for things, it often means that the team is not collaborating together. So they've got different people working on different things, and they want to be able to say, I'm done with my part. Mob programming can be a really good way to help get over that, because if we're all together, all working on delivering something to the user, I'm now not in a place where I can say I've finished something, but I'm waiting on you for the next part, right? We have to just go ahead and deliver it all together. And that's one way to do it. But the big thing you want is that shift in mentality to where people are thinking of, how do I deliver something for the user, even if it's really, really small, not how do I close a bunch of tasks for things. So, John, your thing about is it time to give up on user stories? What you're describing of it spending a lot of time on them, yes, I would absolutely give up on that. The thing of let's talk about what the next most important thing is. If your user stories are literally a title and 3 lines of something you think you might want to do, and then the customer's going in and saying, what's the 10 most important things we want to see next? I think it's doing what you're describing, right? They've just got a way that if anybody thinks of something, you can throw it on the backlog. Maybe it'll get deleted later if you decide you don't want to, but it's just enough information to remember the idea of what you thought you could deliver. So, John, I think I agree with you. The piece that I would make sure is you need The value of the user story is to make sure you know what the next most important thing is and you're not doing something random. So I think that would be the piece that I would really look at, is making sure that you have some way, and usually user stories are a good way to do that, but some way to make sure you know what the most important thing is that you could be working on next.